Okay, very good. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'd like to welcome all of you here this afternoon, and also those who will be tuning in by webcast, who will be watching us via the webcast. Our event today is entitled Europe at the Crossroad, or at a Crossroad, Civil Society Efforts to Counter Religious Hatred and Bigotry in Europe. Today's forum is sponsored by the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, of which I have the honor to be chairman. Several of my colleagues, members of the Commission, are here, as well as members of our staff. The United States Commission on International Religious Freedom is an independent, bipartisan federal commission which monitors religious freedom abroad and makes policy recommendations on its advancement to the President, the Secretary of State, and the Congress. We're also heavily involved, of course, in public education. Now, when people picture Europe, especially Western Europe, they tend to envision well-established democracies in which fundamental rights, such as the human right to religious freedom, enjoy strong protection relative to the rest of the world. And of course, there's great truth in this. In many ways, Western Europe was and remains a beacon of freedom and the home of countless individuals who labor in the trenches on behalf of the fundamental human right to religious freedom and other basic human rights. Yet, despite this entirely admirable record, Western Europe is not immune from religious freedom restrictions. Indeed, our Commission's monitoring of religious freedom in Western Europe has found an increasing number of restrictions on certain forms of religious expression that affect both Muslims and Jews across the region. Recent examples include limitations on Islamic headscarves, the hijab for women, or face coverings, restraints on halal and kosher slaughter, and attempts to restrict religious circumcisions of male infants. Equally importantly, our Commission has noted that these restrictions arise from and encourage a climate of societal intolerance against these communities, a climate which can include then harassment, discrimination, and sometimes, alas, even acts of violence. And we are concerned, indeed alarmed, that these incidents appear to be increasing in some places. Anti-Muslim activity has risen alarmingly in several Western European countries. Xenophobic nationalist elements and groups and parties, including neo-Nazis, stoke the flames of hatred, cynically feeding off terrorist attacks launched by radical Islamist actors, such as the recent assault on Brussels and earlier attacks in Paris, while exploiting popular fears in the wake of the arrival of a record number of mostly Muslim refugees escaping the turmoil in African and Middle Eastern nations. These same xenophobic parties and groups also target Jews, as do radical Islamists who recruit from disaffected members of Muslim communities. In addition, opposition to Israeli policies, especially from those on the far left of the European political spectrum, sometimes crosses the line into anti-Semitism with pro-Palestinian demonstrations, certainly legitimate in themselves, sometimes devolving into violence against Jews and Jewish sites, certainly not legitimate. The rise in anti-Semitic incidents has produced a dramatic increase in Jewish emigration from Europe to Israel, with immigration to Israel from France alone increasing from more than 2,000 in 2012 to nearly 8,000 persons last year. And of course, anyone who knows anything about the important and very distinguished Jewish community in France and its great history, anyone who knows anything about that will share our alarm that such a thing could be happening in France. By any measure, this rising tide of anti-Muslim and anti-Jewish societal hatred should be of serious concern to all. And so the purpose of our event today is to have a forthright conversation about our shared concerns and to exchange constructive ideas for solutions or ways of working towards solutions, with a special focus on efforts that might be made at the grassroots level, efforts by civil society organizations, efforts by students, and especially efforts by faith leaders from all the different traditions, efforts across the board to combat religious bigotry, counter religious extremism, and advance the dream that we all have for a peaceful coexistence of religions living in harmony, religious people from various faiths living in harmony with each other and in an atmosphere of mutual respect, free from violence, free from intimidation, free from discrimination. Today's event will be structured as follows. First, we will hear from my very distinguished friend, beloved friend, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, who will provide our opening remarks, followed by a conversation between Lord Sacks and myself. Lord Sacks is a global religious leader, philosopher, professor, and best-selling author, most recently of the very important book, Not in God's Name. He is a universally recognized voice of reason and indeed voice of conscience for our time. We are indeed, Jonathan, very, very fortunate and blessed to have you with us today, and thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Following Lord Sacks's remarks, we will show a short video and hold a panel discussion in which civil society leaders will discuss their work on the ground and the lessons they have learned and the best practices that they have gleaned from their experiences. Our four panelists are Rabbi Andrew Baker of the American Jewish Committee, who is also the OSCE representative on combating anti-Semitism, Benjamin Fisher of the European Union of Jewish Students, Akila Ahmed, an equalities campaigner from the United Kingdom, and Usama Hassan of the Quilliam Foundation. For further information about our speakers, our panelists, please refer to the bios that we have given you in the handouts, but I don't see people with the handouts. Have the handouts been? They do have them. Very good, very good. And that panel will be moderated by my distinguished colleague, Commissioner Hannah Rosenthal, who also served as the U.S. Special Envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism between 2009 and 2012. And we're delighted to have Hannah with her expertise, Commissioner Rosenthal with her expertise in that role. Finally, we will close with comments from two more of my distinguished fellow commissioners, Dr. James Zogby and Dr. Katrina Lantos Sweat. Before handing things over to Lord Sacks, let me tell you just a little more about him, starting with something that caused a great cheer from his friends and multitudes of admirers here in the United States, and that is his being named as the winner of the 2016 Templeton Prize in religion. I told Jonathan that the cheer that they heard over in England just going across the Atlantic was, actually it was from Princeton, New Jersey, but I think it was joined in by people from across the country. Rabbi Sacks is currently the Ingeborg and Ira Rennert Global Distinguished Professor of Judaic Thought at New York University and the Kressel and Efrat Family Professor, University Professor of Jewish Thought at Yeshiva University. He is Emeritus Professor of Law, Ethics, and the Bible at King's College, London. Rabbi Sacks, Lord Sacks, earlier served as the Chief Rabbi of the United Hebrew Congregations of the Commonwealth between September 1991 and September 2013. Interestingly, only the sixth incumbent since that role was formalized all the way back in 1845. Rabbi Sacks, Lord Sacks, is, of course, a prolific author. He has written more than 25 books, and again, I want to recommend, above all, his many important and valuable works. His most recent one, the magisterial work, Not in God's Name. It was published here in the United States in October, and there he grapples with some of the topics that we have before us on the table today, especially the phenomenon of religious extremism and violence. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in extending a very warm American welcome to our friend, Lord Sacks. either way.
Would you mind if
Certainly.
I stood up? Professor George, beloved friends, thank you for the privilege of just spending time with you in this extraordinary group. There could not be a more important cause right now, because religious freedom, Article 18 of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is today more honored in the breach than in the observance. You have documented that, and it gets worse and worse. And I simply can't imagine a more important topic or a more distinguished group of people to address it. And I salute your president, Robert George, who is a shining light for all of us, of whatever faith. And thank you and bless you, and may you and all of you be rewarded by bringing the light of tolerance and mutual respect into the world in this dark moment. Friends, we're just coming up to the Jewish festival of Passover, which is the great festival of religious freedom. It's also a lot of hard work, I have to say, because it involves, cleaning out, new set of dishes. It's huge. And I remember in the 1970s reading that somebody had noted the phenomenon that the 1960s were the first time when American women went to college in equal numbers to men. And by the 1970s, they found themselves married with children, and there was a best-selling apron which read, "For this, we went to college." So I once suggested in a sermon that we might have one especially made for Passover cleaning, which read, "For this, we left Egypt." But if I may, just begin with a little rabbinic word, if I may, because we have a very ancient ritual on Passover, the Seder service, where we tell the story, reenact the story, and hand on our memories to our children. And it begins with the most extraordinary thing. It begins just before the young ask the questions, the famous questions that start the Seder service. We lift up the matzah, the unleavened bread, and we say, "Halach ma'anya dichalu avasana b'Mitzrayim." It's in Aramaic. This is the bread of affliction which our ancestors ate in Egypt. All who are hungry, come and eat. And I was puzzled by this. What kind of hospitality is it to say, "Come, sit down, have a meal with us. Here's your share of affliction"? I mean, what kind of hospitality is that? I was also very puzzled by the fact that at the beginning we call it the bread of affliction, but at the end, just before the meal, we quote the Bible, which says that the Israelites were leaving Egypt in such a hurry that they weren't able to let the bread rise. So at the beginning, it's the bread of affliction they ate in Egypt, but at the end, it's the bread of freedom that they ate as they were leaving Egypt. So how to understand these things? And these words stayed with me for a very long time, until I read Primo Levi's account of Auschwitz called "If This Is a Man." And incidentally, that was a very important title. It didn't write "If This Is a Jew," because the Holocaust really does not teach us what it is to be a Jew. It teaches us what it is to be human. And it really is about our shared humanity. And he says that the worst time in Auschwitz, believe it or not, were the 10 or 11 days between the Germans leaving and the liberating Russians arriving. Because whoever could walk were taken by the Nazis on the death marches. So all who were left in the camp for 10 days in the freezing winter, between January 17th and January the 27th, were the sick and the dying. And they had no electricity, no food. Everyone had left. And he describes how he, with a friend, was scrabbling in the dirt to see if they could dig up from this frozen ground a potato or a carrot, some root vegetable. And some people in the camp saw them, and they'd lit a fire, and they said, "Come and join us. Come and share our food." He said that at that moment, we were no longer prisoners. We had become free human beings. And I suddenly saw that even if what we eat is the bread of affliction, if we are willing to share it with someone else, we have already begun the process of turning affliction into freedom. And that is why the work of this group is so important, because it is all of us standing together in defense of the religious liberty of each of us. And that stands a chance of success. Whereas if we stand on our own, we stand no chance whatsoever. So standing together on this, across party lines, across religious lines, across denominational lines, is incredibly important. The truth is that things are difficult in Europe and throughout the world. I have been very, very shocked by what has been happening in Europe. To give you a very simple example, Paris was the intellectual capital of Europe in the end of the 19th century. And it was in the streets of Paris in 1894 that a highly assimilated German Austrian journalist from Vienna, who was reporting on the Dreyfus trial for his newspaper back in Vienna, heard the crowds cry, mort aux Juifs, death to the Jews. And he realized if that could happen in Paris, then Europe was no longer safe for Jews. The man was called Theodor Herzl, and that was the beginning of secular Zionism. 120 years later, in the summer of 2014, those same cries were heard in the streets of Paris. And that they should happen within living memory of the Holocaust is quite difficult. That's Paris. Well, the French always go one better than the rest of us. But you can imagine how shocking it was for us in Britain when just a few days ago, a very sweet Muslim shopkeeper called Asad Khan sent out a little email to his customers telling them how privileged he felt as a Muslim to live in a country that granted him and his children freedom. And he wished his Christian customers a happy Easter. A Sunni radical picked this up and within hours had gone round to his shop, stabbed him 30 times, murdered him, stamped on his face. And later, 2 days later, confessed quite openly that he had done so because the shopkeeper, who was an Ahmadiyya Muslim, had, in his words, disrespected Islam. And in justification of his act, he said, if I hadn't done it, somebody else certainly would have done. Now, that's difficult when you see that happening in Glasgow. And it's quite troubling. A young woman councillor in Britain, just today, it's in today's news, has been removed from the Labour Party for tweeting quite openly that Hitler was the greatest man in history, etc., etc. This is happening in Britain. And in Britain, tolerance is simply the default option. Since I've been spending a fair amount of time in New York, I know in New York, when it gets cold, it gets really cold. When it gets hot, it gets really hot. But in England, we do soggy miserable to a T. And this is not a good environment for being a fanatic. You know, so if you find fanaticism growing in Britain, it is troubling. It is really troubling. Some years ago, the Archbishop of Canterbury called me in to address the Christian-Muslim Forum, which I did, and we had a very interesting conversation with a lot of Muslim leaders from around Britain. Very nice and good people. And at the end of our conversation, we had a buffet lunch, and we took our food and sat where we chose, and a Muslim community leader from Liverpool, undoubtedly the most moderate man in the room, sat next to me and shared with me his concerns. He was from Liverpool. Liverpool have, am I speaking a foreign language here, or do you know what soccer is? Liverpool, I mean, football clubs in Britain generate enormous passion. Almost in Liverpool, almost a religion. The famous manager of Liverpool Football Club, Bill Shankly, said football isn't a matter of life and death, it's much more important than that. And Liverpool had been playing a big match in the European Cup. And they happened to have a Jewish Israeli footballer called Cohen, who scored the winning goal. And this community leader from Liverpool told me, he said, I stood up to cheer, it was the winning goal, and my son, who's 16 years old, pulled me down and said, Dad, how can you cheer? He's a Jew. And then the community leader turned to me and said, my son has not yet said, kill the Jews, but I don't know what's going to become of him. Now, if parents are powerless in the face of the radicalization of their children, we're in a difficult situation. We're in a very difficult situation. I don't know, Robbie, would you like me to quickly go through a little of the argumentation of not in God's name?
Please,
or just,
please, Jonathan. Yeah.
if I can just share with you one small fragment of my argument in Not in God's Name, which I wrote out of a dire sense of emergency. I'll share it with you. And here it is. In one chapter, I think it's chapter 3 or 4, I just note the fact that there were two remarkable manuscript discoveries in the Middle East in the 1940s. One of them very well known, young shepherd, Palestinian shepherd, looking after his sheep, idly throws a stone into one of the caves in the Dead Sea and hears the sound of breaking jars, and out of that came the great manuscript discovery we know as the Dead Sea Scrolls. We sometimes are less aware of an almost equally remarkable discovery in the same part of the world, not quite the same part of the world, but close, 2 years earlier, when somebody in the Sinai Desert found buried a cache of early Christian manuscripts known as the Nag Hammadi manuscripts, found in the Sinai Desert in 1945. Now, these two sets of manuscripts are different in many ways. The Dead Sea Scrolls are Jewish texts. The Nag Hammadi manuscripts are Christian texts. There's several centuries between them. The Dead Sea Scrolls are between the 1st and 3rd centuries BCE. The Nag Hammadi manuscripts date from the 4th century CE. But they're interesting in one respect. The Nag Hammadi manuscripts are Coptic translations of texts originally written in Greek, including 9 Gospels, the text of which had not been available earlier. They're known as the Gnostic Gospels. What is striking is that although these were Jews and these were Christians and there were centuries between them, both of them had something unusual about them because Judaism and Christianity are both monotheisms. But the Dead Sea Scrolls sectarians and the Nag Hammadi Christians, both groups were dualists. That is, they believed that there are 2 forces operative in the universe, not just one. As well as the goodly and godly force for good, there's also a force for evil, Satan, the devil, Antichrist, Lucifer, Prince of Darkness, name it Mastema, name it what you will. Famously, the Dead Sea sectarians spoke about the coming clash between the children of light and the children of darkness. And the Nag Hammadi Christians believed that the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament were completely separate deities. The God of the Old Testament was the one who created the universe. That's why it's so terrible. And the God of the New Testament is God who will save us from this world and from the physical pains and injustices. And it is very fascinating to ask, how is it that a monotheism gives rise to a dualism? I mean, we know the sources of dualism were not there at all. They came from some form of Zoroastrianism, on the one hand and some form of Greek mystery cults on the other. So they're not native to Judaism and Christianity, and those sects remain just sects. They never had major impact. But what is it that forces a monotheist to become a dualist? And I suggest the answer is when those groups experience more cognitive dissonance than they can bear. When the world that is unfolding out there is simply so unlike the world that should be evolving out there because our sacred texts say so and because we followed all the instructions. So how was it the Dead Sea sectarians wanted to know, in essence, that the victory of the Hasmoneans over the Seleucid Greeks did not lead to the restoration of the glory of the temple, but indeed the Hasmoneans just got thoroughly Hellenized themselves, and that is when a group of priests left Jerusalem and established their sect. So history didn't pan out the way the books said it was going to do, and obviously the Christians believed that, the crucifixion, the death and the resurrection of Jesus was going to change the world. The world wasn't changing, therefore the real message of Christianity must not be a this worldly one, but another worldly one, and so on. When there is too much cognitive dissonance, you resolve it by becoming a dualist. The rabbis took the most powerful text in the whole of the Hebrew Bible, which is a verse in Isaiah which says, Yotzeh or u'verechoshek, God forms light and creates darkness. Oseh shalom, he makes peace, u'voreh hara, and creates evil. So good and evil both come from God. We took that sentence, changed the last word to make it just slightly less jarring, and put it as the first sentence of every morning's communal prayer. We still say that prayer every single morning. So when it is impossible to say this evil comes from God as punishment for what we've done, because nothing we've done deserves punishment like that, you begin to think that there must be an evil force at work in the universe. And that's when monotheists become dualists. Why is this important? I think it's terribly, terribly important. Because when monotheists become dualists, a switch is flipped that changes the entire evolution of a civilization. Everything changes. Why? Because when bad things happen to a group, it can ask one of two questions. And the entire future of the group will depend on which of those two questions it asks. It can ask, what did we do wrong? Or it can ask, who did this to us? If you're a monotheist, you ask, what did we do wrong? And that takes you in the direction of remorse, repentance, atonement. But if you ask, who did this to us? Then you move in another direction altogether. Now, only very rarely does this become dangerous. The Dead Sea sectarians and the Nag Hammadi sectarians were not active, they weren't dangerous, they waited for God to deal with it, but under certain conditions this can become very dangerous. And I want to explain why. We know from the last 20 years of work on evolutionary psychology, on what is called the evolution of cooperation, and on neuroscientific studies, that natural to human beings is what the late James Q. Wilson called the moral sense. We have an instinctive moral sense. We know through iterated prisoner's dilemma and all this stuff that every single group that wants to survive as a group has to operate a code called reciprocal altruism. If you act well to me, I will act well to you. And we know the neuroscience of this as well, which is that we have something that they call nowadays mirror neurons, and mirror neurons are the things that make us wince when we see somebody else in pain. So we have, on coming at us from two different directions, something called the moral sense, which makes it very hard for us to be really vicious, cruel, mean, or murderous towards our fellow human beings. There is such a thing as a moral sense, and we now know exactly how it evolved and how it affected the architecture of the brain. In other words, for real terror of the kind that we've been seeing around the world to emerge, something has to happen to disable the moral sense. I mean, there were terrorists who killed how many? 16, 20, I've forgotten the final number, of holidaymakers in the Ivory Coast just a week or two ago. One of them was a 5-year-old boy who on his knees was begging for his life. How do you actually shoot between the eyes a 5-year-old boy begging for his life just because he's a Christian? You have to disable the moral sense. And I want to explain to you how dualism does this. It does it in 3 ways, and they're very powerful. Number one, it dehumanizes my opponents. They are children of darkness. My side are the children of light. We are good, they are bad. And there's no light and shade in this. We are completely good, they are completely bad. And therefore, they are no longer truly human. The Hutus in Rwanda called the Tutsis inyenzi, cockroaches. The Germans called the Jews vermin, lice, cancer, a gangrenous limb. Once you dehumanize your opponent, you disable the faculty that I've called the mirror neurons. Those people aren't human, therefore you don't feel empathy or sympathy. Their pain does not bring you pain. Number two, the second you ask who did this to us instead of what did I do wrong, you have defined yourself as a victim. If you are the victim, you have henceforth been liberated. You have abdicated all moral responsibility. I didn't do this, they did it to me, and I'm just responding to what they did to me. So you disable empathy and you disable responsibility. And those two switches switch off the moral sense. But what is worst of all is that the young people who become jihadis or suicide bombers or violent Christians attacking Muslims in Nigeria, or Hindu nationalists doing likewise, or even Buddhists in Sri Lanka and Myanmar. What you do is by portraying your people as the victim of somebody else's evil, you then enlist the highest form of altruism in the young people who say, I must rise to the defense of my people. And the worse the act is, the holier it is. Because I'm doing this to protect God from the enemies of God and my people from the enemies of my people. And I had to coin a new phrase in the book to define this, and I call it altruistic evil. Evil committed for the highest of motives. When you dehumanize, when you define yourself as a victim, and when you engage in altruistic evil, the entire infrastructure that keeps us from harming other human beings is disabled, and you can commit evil without remorse. This, to my mind, is very dangerous. And I believe, ultimately, there's only one solution. And that solution is called monotheism. Why? Because the universe of polytheism sees the world full of powerful and contending forces. Whereas monotheism takes all those forces and brings them together in one personality, the God of Abraham. And that transforms the human personality. And it was Jack Miles, a Jesuit, who made the very, very powerful point that that is the difference between Greek myth and Western drama, between Oedipus and Hamlet. Oedipus is fighting a whole set of forces already announced before his birth by the Delphic oracle, and the more he, Oedipus, and his father Laius act to avoid the prophecies coming true, the more they make them come true. So Oedipus is fighting something outside himself which is bigger than himself. Whereas Hamlet, all the forces operating on Hamlet are inside his head, where the native hue of resolution is cichlid o'er by the pale cast of thought. The second we move from the question, who did this to me? The dualist question, to the monotheist question, what did I do wrong? Then we move to that logic of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam that says the real battlefield is the one in here. The real heroism is not to conquer your enemies, but to conquer the lesser angels of your nature. And when that happens, you generate a struggle in the mind which allows you to make peace in the world. That is a theological response to what is happening today to all the great religions in the world. They are all somewhere in the world among the victims, and they are all somewhere in the world among the perpetrators. So it's important for each of us to recognize, and my book is mainly about these dark tendencies in Judaism, because I'm not going to speak as a Jew about Christian, Islamic, or any other theology, but I've tried to give an analysis of what it is to wrestle with the dangerous forces in your own faith. And I've been terribly moved that the most enthusiastic readers of the book have been Muslims, followed by Christians. Jews, well, you know, we all know better than try to persuade Jews. But I mean, so there it is. Now, finally, to return to the actual topic of today, what can civil society do? The answer is it can do a great deal. I made my work as chief rabbi over 22 years. I made that absolutely central to my work. So, for instance, the BBC used to ask me each year before our Jewish New Year to do a television program as a message to the nation. On many of those occasions, I took the opportunity of making that television program to show the most beautiful faces of the Muslim community in Britain. So, for instance, in 2002, you may remember there was an American journalist called Daniel Pearl who was murdered in Karachi. Well, so I took the Pakistani High Commissioner Akbar Ahmed and Daniel Pearl's father, Judea. And they came together and they became friends. And I filmed them. This extraordinary friendship that had built up between them, and I took them into a Muslim school and into a Jewish school. We filmed the whole thing. It's incredibly moving. Judea Pearl said something very simple and incredibly powerful. He said, hate killed my son. So I'm going to spend the rest of my life fighting hate. It was that simple. It was beautiful. Another year, I took the cameras to an Orthodox Jewish day school under my aegis in Birmingham, which must be quite unusual because there are not many Orthodox Jewish day schools where the majority of pupils are Muslim. It's unusual. It was a big school. The Jewish community had numerically declined. So 80% of the kids were of other faiths, mainly Muslim, but also Sikh and Hindu and some Chinese. I just, it was nice to show on British television a Muslim parent saying we moved to this part of Birmingham especially so we could send our kids to a Jewish school. And I sat with the kids for a day and we filmed this, just learning the Israel-Palestinian peace song, which we taught them to sing in Hebrew and Arabic and English. And it really moved people when they were, they're panning across these 5, 6-year-olds singing about peace together. We tried to do this in lots and lots of ways. In general, we tried, as religious leaders in Britain, behind the scenes, to really work at these good intercommunal relations, and they really happened. Britain became, I think, pretty much a model of good practice. And the end result was that we realized we had to be there for others if we wanted others to be there for us. So when anti-Semitism began for the first time to appear on British university campuses, I called in the leaders of the Jewish Student Association, and I said, you're going to be facing a lot of anti-Semitism for the next while. And they have for 14 years without interruption. I said, I'm going to ask you to do something unusual. Yes, we'll fight anti-Semitism, and I will be there standing alongside you. But I want you to lead the fight against Islamophobia. You know, if you are hurting because people hate you, then stand in solidarity with other people who are also facing prejudice. Out of that emerged something called the Coexistence Trust, Jews and Muslims fighting anti-Semitism and Islamophobia together. And we know that we need support from governments. But we also know there are certain things governments can't do, that only we can do, by extending the hand of friendship across the boundaries between faiths. And that is an enormously unifying force wherever it's done. So I commend you yet again, say there is huge work for civil society to do, to say that for the first time in history, we recognize that all the faiths are at risk. And maybe for the first time in history, all the faiths can stand together, recognizing our shared humanity under the sovereignty of God. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you, Lord Sachs. Before we have a little conversation up here, I want to mention a couple of other very special people in attendance. I mentioned my commission colleagues who will be participating in our event today, Commissioner Rosenthal, Commissioner Lantos-Sweat, and Commissioner Zogby. Also with us is Commissioner Thomas Rees, Father Thomas Rees, who is here. And we're delighted to have our friend and ex officio member of our commission, Ambassador at Large for Religious Freedom, David Saperstein, who's here with us today. Jonathan, looking at the situation in Europe in particular, what do we know about the worst elements? And I know there are many different categories and descriptions, but what do we know about the worst elements when it comes to actual violence against victims, be they Muslim victims or be they Jewish victims or victims who are victimized because of some other faith? Are they very devout members of their own faiths? Do they tend to be disaffected people who are not particularly religious or particularly devout? I would imagine, for example, the skinhead element or the neo-Nazi element would not, but correct me if I'm wrong, be religiously affiliated or certainly not religiously devout. What more do we know? I'm told, for example, by my friend Jennifer Bryson, who studied some of this, especially Islamist radicalism, that in many cases, the worst perpetrators of acts of violence in the name, ostensibly in the name of Islam, are not actually religiously devout Muslims at all. Rather, they're often young men who do very un-Islamic things, smoke marijuana, they're involved in pornography heavily, and so forth. What do we know about these perpetrators?
The first thing is we have to say what we don't know, because by now we know there's no psychological profile of a suicide bomber. There's no way of scanning lots of people's records and saying that one will and that one will. There is no psychological profile. But in the case of Europe as a whole, they tend to be certainly people who are lost souls. They may have been radicalized in prison. In Britain, many of them have been radicalized in prison, so they are criminals with a criminal record. But in general, these are not people who know a great deal about Islam. They may know no more than they picked up from the internet and from a summer at a madrasa in Pakistan. So these are not the most religious. The problem is, though, that there are radicalizing elements among the imams in Britain. There are preachers of hate. But the real radicalization takes place not on the basis of religious text, but a sense of who am I, a need to belong. I've tried to explain to people this. It's really tough for them to understand. when my late father came to Britain as a refugee from Poland, there was something to integrate into. Everyone knew what it was to be English. The kids who came from Nazi Germany on Kindertransport, they used to describe how, for instance, the first meal they had in the non-Jewish home that had adopted them in England, and they hadn't eaten for a long time, so they were greedily eating up all the food. And one of them said to me, and my adoptive mother said to me, in England, it's rude to eat all the food. You leave something on the plate, And on the one hand, she was starving, but on the other hand, somebody was saying, guys, we want you to belong, so learn the rules. Today, there aren't any rules of belonging. I used to say that a whole generation of Jews had written on their tombstone, a proud Englishman and a proud Jew. Now, I can tell you today what it is to be a proud Jew. I can't tell you what it is to be a proud Englishman. That is a problem. And it was in 1897 that a great sociologist called Emil Durkheim published a book called Suicide, in which he said that where there is anomie, where there is the lack of a shared moral code in a society, the rate of suicide will rise. Now, he never saw that analysis might apply to today's suicide bomber. But it's the same principle. There is anomie out there. And for anyone from a traditional background, you can't make yourself at home in a country where there is no at home, where there's no code of at-homeness, where everything is up to the individual, where there's no sexual ethos, there's no principle of modesty or obligation. So, I try and explain to the government and to my fellow religious leaders, don't put all the blame on the radicals. We are at fault in not giving people principles to internalize. And the former head of the Race Relations Commission, Trevor Phillips, will someday this week be presenting a program on British television on the non-integration of the Muslims in Britain. And he will say, we have to actually set out the rules much more clearly. So by and large, these are people who hadn't been deeply devout, who don't know much about Islam. One of them notoriously carried with him a copy, on his way to his mission, a copy of Islam for Dummies. And these are people who are really, individuals searching for some cause and some group to identify with and to sacrifice their lives for.
What are you wrestling within the Jewish community when it comes to bad attitudes toward Muslims generally? The tendency to blame everybody, blame the group for the bad acts of the bad actors?
I think we all fall into the victim mentality when given the chance. And when, after the Holocaust, Jews fell into that victim mentality. But the people who never fell into that victim mentality were the Holocaust survivors. They never gave rise to that thing at all. These were the people who stood up for Muslims being persecuted in Bosnia and Kosovo. They are the people who shared their platform on Holocaust Memorial Day with the victims of Rwanda. So I was able, if you read my books, a lot of them are arguments against the victim mentality within Judaism, a whole slew of them. And I would always take exactly the opposite approach. We are not going to blame anyone else. We are going to work out our own problems ourselves, and then we're going to go out and stand in solidarity with others. And the fact that I was able to do this quite a lot in using the Holocaust survivors as a role model became very powerful, and we did then enlist all our rabbis as well as all our young lay leaders to become absolute and dedicated activists to good communal relations between Jews and Christians, Jews and Muslims, Jews and Sikhs and Hindus, and the rest.
I mentioned those worrying figures about the emigration from France of so many French Jews in just the past few years. Is there something similar happening in Britain, or is the situation at least a little better there?
Well, a lot of the French Jews are coming to Britain. So they think it's better.
They think it's better, yeah.
I am absolutely determined that we don't leave Britain, that we stand and fight, because, as I have said many, many times, if it's not safe to be a Jew on the streets of Europe, then it's not safe to be a European on the streets of Europe. Full stop. No one can stand aside from this struggle, and no one should run away from it. So I think Britain is a much more benign atmosphere. But I can't necessarily say that for every country in Europe. 8 years ago, in May 2007, I went privately, I shared this with you, I went privately to see together the three leaders of Europe, Angela Merkel, head of the European Commission, what's his name, Barroso, Manuel Barroso, head of the EU, and Hans-Gert Pöttering, the head of the European Parliament in Strasbourg. And I said to them, today the Jews of Europe are asking, is there a future for Jews in Europe? And this should concern you, the leaders of Europe. So that was 8 years ago. And unfortunately, the trajectory that's unfolded in Paris, in Brussels, and so on, is not a good one. So I think Britain's the exception here, because Jews today are leaving France, they're leaving Holland, they're leaving Denmark, Norway, Sweden, they're leaving Belgium. And, the future of the other communities remains unclear. There are Jews in Germany, there are Jews in Italy, there are Jews in Spain. So I don't know what, but I do see something very frightening happening there.
How much of the problem between Jews and Muslims has to do with the passions aroused by the Israel-Palestine question, and how much is something else?
Quite a lot of it is due to the Israel-Palestinian thing, because you can measure when levels are high and when they're low, and the high levels of anti-Semitic attacks always occur in conjunction with some particular moment of tension in the Middle East, in Israel-Palestine. So a lot of it is bound up with that. And I keep saying to the Muslim community, guys, instead of importing a message of conflict from the Middle East to Britain, let's export a message of coexistence from Britain to the Middle East. And I have to say they don't disagree. I mean, the leadership of the Muslim community understands that this is what we should do.
We followed on our commission with great interest the recent meeting in Marrakesh, in which Muslims from many different traditions and cultures, Muslim leaders gathered to discuss the question of how to protect the rights of non-Muslims in predominantly Muslim societies. Is that something that you yourself followed? Have you seen the declaration coming out of Marrakesh?
Yeah, it was a very important declaration.
What do you make of it?
I don't know what I make of it, but in general, I believe that religious leadership can do so much more than it has been empowered to do. So, for instance, in 2001, the then Crown Prince Hassan of Jordan and I persuaded George Carey, the then Archbishop of Canterbury, to convene a group of Jews, Muslims, and Christians from the Middle East. And that was called the Alexandria process. And he did it brilliantly. This was George Carey. It was a beautiful thing. Muslims, Jews, and Christians really wrestled together and came out with a significantly enhanced mutual understanding. What sunk it was that in the end, it never meshed with any political process. It was never recognized as a kind of track to diplomacy. So they came out with these wonderful resolutions, but they never got anywhere. And that's how you guarantee that the next effort will be much harder. Now, I have to tell you, a recent report just came out on the Oslo peace process between 1993 and 2000, and came out with the conclusion that every aspect of relationships between Israelis and Palestinians was looked at except one, the religious dimension. How are you going to create peace in the Middle East between Jews, Muslims, and Christians without confronting the religious dimension? As long as Tony Blair was Prime Minister, his press officer, Alastair Campbell, would never let him talk about his religious beliefs. So after he was Prime Minister...
He famously said, "We don't do God."
We don't do God,
Yeah.
exactly. So after he was Prime Minister, once he'd resigned or retired, I said to him, "You can now do God." And I did for BBC television, I did the first interview with Tony Blair when he was no longer Prime Minister. And he spoke very eloquently, among other things, of how his own religious beliefs and his own religious situation, at that time, a Protestant married to a Catholic, he's since converted to Catholicism, but at that time, how his own religious situation helped him on the Northern Ireland peace process. And he said, what was different between me and the other people who tried bringing peace to Northern Ireland is they saw religion as the problem. I saw it as part of the solution.
To what do you attribute that attitude that would factor out of all things religion? Is it just the general lack of understanding of religion among secular elites?
Huge.
Yeah.
I mean, they really don't like religion very much. There's a very distinguished philosopher in New York who once very honestly wrote, "I hope God doesn't exist."
I'll say the name, it was Thomas Nagel.
Anyway, so, there is a very strong secularism that affects British television, for instance, not so much British radio. And it's kind of been eased out of the newspapers. And that's terrible because religion is playing an ever greater part in people's lives. The 21st century is going to be more religious than the 20th century was. And you can't keep behaving as if it didn't exist, which the French policy of laïcité actually does. It kind of, you can't talk about it.
How serious, since we're on laïcité, how seriously are you concerned? What level of concern should we have about some of the matters that I mentioned in my opening remarks? The prohibitions of halal and kosher slaughter, the prohibitions on infant male circumcision, the prohibitions on the wearing of the headscarf by Muslim women or small jewelry items concerning having the Star of David or the cross in French or Belgian public institutions?
Well, many of these things originated in France, not all of them. And you can see what happened in France. I mean, it achieved nothing. It just made France an obvious target for terrorist attack. I mean, you don't deal with religious difference by trying to impose it top down by government fiat. I mean, that is an absolute, it had to fail as a policy.
Before our time is exhausted, I'd like you to say a word about the situation in Eastern Europe. We've spoken mostly about the Western European countries. They have their particular problems. What is your perception of the situation, especially with the migration crisis and so forth, the situation in the East European and former Soviet bloc countries?
Oddly enough, and ironically enough, in a situation where for 70 years Jews were not able to practice Judaism in public, indeed religion was simply forced underground. Today there is less anti-Semitism in those FSU countries than in most of the countries of Central and Western Europe. I mean, anti-Semitism has become really, really serious in countries like Hungary, for instance. Poland is not a great place to be. But in the former FSU countries, for the most part, there's been a revitalization of Jewish life, and the lay and religious leaders of those countries tell me that anti-Semitism is at a low ebb compared to the rest of Europe.
What about hostility to Muslims?
I mean, in Russia there is significant, there really is significant hostility, but I don't have direct communication with East European Muslim leaders.
Yeah. Well, we have to make room for our next panel, which should be very interesting. But Jonathan, thank you so much for being with us today, and please join me in thanking Lord Sachs for being our guest. Anna, over to you. Oh, we're going to show the film? Yeah, I think so. I think the plan was to show the film.
even more people to come and share with us their realities on the ground, we were able to reach some people in Europe, and they are going to be featured in this short video. Their names are on there, so I won't go through who's going to be on it, but this will be a nice segue into our panel discussions. So here you go, technology. Here we go, technology.
It's a quite a global phenomenon. It's not only a European phenomenon. I think Europe, you talk about at a crossroad, and it's one of the things. I'm an American, you might hear. For me, I've been here 18 years now in Brussels, and the thing that it's a metaphor that I've held for a very long time in terms of Europe geographically is at the crossroad, literally, right, between East and West, so to speak, right, and in terms of the demographic of the diversity within Europe, particularly Western Europe, right, we're really living the interaction of these cultures, and so it's what has driven me to actually be here and work here. Is it seems like a critical place and time to be in at this crossroad of something that's really a global concern.
So the first thing is working on reports. So we have been working with community-based organization, trying to ask people to go to the police and report about what they have been through. This is one, because there's a lot of mistrust between the Muslim communities and the police because of because of profiling that has happened throughout years, and because that most of the people don't trust police and don't trust the public institutions. So the first thing was asking people to go in the police and report. The second one is trying to mobilize the civil society on what it is to be a Muslim woman on a daily basis. When you go to school and you try to bring your children and you're not allowed to enter school, what it looks like when you are in the bus and people are insulting you. So we have been writing op-eds. We have been doing videos after the terrorist attack to mainly mobilize the public opinion about those issues. The third thing was advocating. We have been pushing a lot into the European Commission, into the European Parliament, for politicians to hold a colloquium on anti-Semitism and on Islamophobia. We have been doing a lot of public conference and of public press conference to mobilize people, also to push our politicians to take a stand and to really acknowledge the crisis we're living in terms of identity and in terms of racism and hatred. And the fourth one was mainly education. Education through workshop in schools, in public schools, education in public organization in suburbs of Paris. So I have been touring, and I'm still continuing this work. I've been touring in the main banlieue suburbs of Paris and of the main cities in France to do interfaith work, or to bring people to talk about Islam, or to bring people of different faiths to talk to each other and to get to know each other in order to break the ice between the different communities and between the different citizens in the country.
We have been working a lot with Muslim communities, and I think this is something that is very important because there's no doubt about the fact that some of the prejudice comes within the Muslim community. So we've been working in particular with Muslim youth to try and help encourage them learn about Judaism, learn about Israel, learn about Jewish culture, and really keep the dialogue open in the most constructive, instructive way possible. What else have we done? We have been doing quite a lot of work on social media because a lot of the anti-Semitic and hate speech in general is happening on social media, and the need for counter messaging, for also alerting the operators and on some of the hate speech that is going on. So we've been working with Facebook, with Twitter, with those companies here on the ground to sort of try and sort of keep the channels open of discussion, really sort of make sure to create sort of guidelines of what is accepted and what is not, and what can be the ways of sort of alerting very quickly when there is a content that can actually be dangerous. But then also the question very concretely on how do we create counter messages online. Our enemies are out there. They're much more present than the good people. So how can we make sure that together we can find a coherent way of sort of bringing out other messages to young people in particular? And then I think most importantly is the fact that we want to make sure that all aspects of French society are concerned about the issue of anti-Semitism, and not only because it's an issue for Jews or it's an issue for a minority, but more largely because it's an issue for French democratic values. And at the end of the day, it's an issue for all liberal democracies. If a liberal democracy is incapable of protecting its minority, its Jewish citizen anymore, then what good is a liberal democracy for? So it's an issue that we've been saying for years. We've been involving, really wanting to make sure that all aspects of French society are involved, from the very high level political leaders to the civil society leaders to NGOs. And so, yeah, this is really an issue that we've been sort of tackling for many, many years. We're working a lot with non-Jewish NGO sectors on the issue of anti-Semitism, on trans-political, bipartisan on the right and on the left. We've been working a lot with parliamentarians to alert them on the issue of anti-Semitism. And then, yeah, sometimes we also try and create a discussion where anti-Semitism is just one aspect of the larger problem.
Well, in 2015, BMSD actually collaborated with the European Network Against Racism on their Forgotten Women project, which held a series of roundtables on anti-Muslim attacks against women and how to counter anti-Muslim sentiment. Further, I'm a member of the Telmama, or Measuring Anti-Muslim Attacks Advisory Board. The factors that help us make progress are sustainable funding, continuity of staff members, an equal emphasis on sectarian hate crime within Muslim communities, and strong partnerships with other organizations.
The first thing we did was to monitor anti-Semitism. And this monitoring is done through, I would say, a service dedicated to that. And this service among the Jewish community works closely with the Ministry of Interior. It means that last year we had more than 800 of anti-Semitic attacks in France. And this number is recorded both by the services of the Jewish community and the Ministry of Interior. That's very important. And I know that in many countries, the Jewish community has no common figures with the, I would say, official ministry figures. That's something important because it makes it easy to I would say, to consider the whole phenomenon. So first thing was to monitor anti-Semitism. Second thing is to develop strong relationships with other minorities. And we work a lot, for instance, with the representative council of the Muslim institutions in France, which is called CFCM. And we work a lot with them, even if we know, unfortunately, that they do not have a real impact on the ground on the underprivileged population and mainly young people. We were speaking about the sources of anti-Semitism. So that's something which is important to do. We do it. We try to develop that relationship, but it's not so easy to see the real impact. 10 years ago, the CRIF was also the founder of the Muslim-Jewish friendship in France. That's something which is important because, as you know, before that new anti-Semitism, the main source of anti-Semitism in Europe was coming from, I would say, Christianism. That was the case on a historical basis. And we have the feeling that it was possible to overcome that challenge at that time by developing a dialogue with the Christians through, for instance, the Jewish-Christian Friendship Association in France 60 years ago, and then with Nostra Aetate, of course, which was a very important in a way to appease the level and to curb the level of anti-Semitism coming from the Christian world. And we have the feeling today that we have to work as an organization towards something similar with the Muslim community in France, but not only in France, all over Europe and the world. So
we fight all forms of discrimination. So we are confronting anti-Semitism, also Islamophobia, also homophobia. We're working a lot around religion and belief diversity. We're also working on hate crime monitoring, not doing monitoring ourselves so much, but working with experts in hate crime monitoring to train other organizations to better monitor. We're doing that across communities. So we fight all forms of discrimination, and we work very much in intercultural coalitions to forward that agenda. And our kind of core business is training and education. So we're doing anti-bias training and other kinds of capacity building training, like around hate crime monitoring with civil society organizations, also training trainers from public authorities and other sectors. We work mostly with social workers and teachers and other NGOs, I would say.
So when it comes to education, the progress would be coming in the very beginning of the workshop and see what the kids has to say, and just after evaluating the differences between the prejudice or the ideas that they have about Jews, Muslims, or Christian or Buddhist. So we tend to give them a sheet of paper that they have to fill in the first hour, and then at the end of the workshop or at the end of the day or the end of the 3 months after, we give them the same evaluation so we can have a sense of how did they move in the scope. What do they thought about Jews in the very beginning, and what do they thought about Jews at the end? Is the way they look at Jews is more accurate, is more realistic, or is it full of prejudice?
Thank you to staff and all who were able to do that. You holding up a microphone for me?
Yeah, we're gonna have it like.
If I could go to the podium.
Speakers for the next panel, please mute over here so I can put your mics on.
Oh, I do have one. I do have one. Is it on? Okay, ready to go now? Can you all hear me? Is this working? Okay. Well, that was very inspiring. I'm always inspired by Rabbi Sachs, and very provocative in some of his messages. Now we watched local people in Europe respond to what's happening on the ground. And that's what we want to continue to talk about. What is happening on the ground? We know the headlines in papers. We know things are bad. So we want to get to a place of what can we do to make success and move the needle. When I was special envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism, I remember people saying, how can you possibly be successful when you're monitoring this ancient hatred of Jews? And I said, I do not expect anti-Semitism to be obliterated or eradicated during my term. But I'd like to see the needle moved. And that's what, it doesn't sound like grandiose goals, but it was a realistic goal. And so that was my goal. That was my hope. And that's how I approached the job. But I was over here in the State Department. What was really happening on the ground is what we're going to focus on today. You have already heard from our chairman, Robbie George, that we have this 4-person panel. Rabbi Andrew Baker, my friend Andy, of the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe. He is the special envoy there to deal with issues of anti-Semitism, and with the American Jewish Committee. Akila Ahmed is an equalities campaigner for the United Kingdom. I just love that title. And Benjamin Fisher is with the European Union of Jewish Students. And Usama Hassan, hello, is with the Quilliam Foundation. And I'm going to, you have their bios in your handouts. And the format is this. We're going to ask each of the panelists to speak between 5 and 7 minutes. And I will try and make sure that happens. I'm not, I'm not a dictator, but I will be firm. About your work and experiences in countering Islamophobia or hatred of Muslims and hatred of Jews. And then we'll have a conversation on the panel, and we'll leave some time at the end for questions for all of you, if we haven't answered them all. So we'll start with Andrew Baker.
Hannah, thank you. It's good to be with you again.
Good to see you.
Unfortunately, we didn't vanquish the problem of anti-Semitism during your tenure. I don't know that we will during mine at the OSCE. It's in some ways an eternal problem. But I think what we've tried to focus on, and if I look at the work, as you say, on the ground, or at least trying to get the OSCE engaged, which encompasses 57 governments, it has been really, I think, first to get the understanding of governments, of political leaders, to align with what I think more and more Jews came to recognize going back now even 15 years ago, when we saw a real resurgence of anti-Semitic incidents, in particular in Western Europe. As was noted earlier, to some extent these were incidents that were triggered perhaps by events in the Middle East, but they manifested themselves in very serious attacks on Jewish institutions. And initially, governments weren't inclined to even recognize this as being anti-Semitism, somehow putting it into a category. These are sort of political actors and reacting to political developments. So that was the first challenge. Then there was, of course, this recognition, and it remains a serious one, of the security questions. In other words, more and more synagogues, schools, Jews on the street were being physically harassed, physically attacked. That has grown. I don't think you can blame it on a Middle East conflict. There may be spikes when there's an event there, but steadily these numbers where they've been recorded have grown. And by the way, when we speak of numbers, one of the issues has been getting governments to monitor and collect data, getting people to feel comfortable to report that they're victims of hate crimes, anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim actions, whatever. That still remains a very serious problem and challenge for governments. So here we have these elements. And of course, in recent years, we have the overlay now of radical Islamist terrorism. And Jews have been at least high on the list of targets. So as we saw in Paris and in Copenhagen and in Brussels, there is a very real serious threat going beyond just the idea of physical or verbal harassment in day-to-day life. But we need to understand both those elements are present. Now, having said all that, it's not as though the problems that come from the right, the populist, xenophobic, often anti-Semitic political parties have, if anything, during these years of uncertainty about European Union enlargement, problems with refugees, also built on attitudes toward Roma and others, those parties have grown. And many of them certainly feed into an anti-Semitic worldview. Some that anti-Semitism is front and center, such as Jobbik Party in Hungary or Golden Dawn Party in Greece. So this too remains an issue of concern for Jews in Europe. And then finally, and it was one of the issues that was addressed initially in the Berlin Declaration of the OSCE back in 2004, noting that anti-Semitism had taken on new forms and manifestations. Namely, there's an anti-Semitism as it relates to the state of Israel. Essentially, when Israel is demonized, when it is equated with a racist endeavor or analogies drawn to the Nazis, it's not just criticism, it's a form of anti-Semitism. Jewish communities themselves in Europe are often conflated with the state of Israel. They're somehow targeted because of that. Certainly they feel discomfort, at the very least, in expressing in public ways their feelings of support for the state of Israel. So this is yet another dimension of that problem. I think it was understood some years back now by most European Jews and many of the organizations. The question is, can we get governments to first understand it and to deal with it? That remains a problem. It was less than 2 years ago when I met with political leaders in Copenhagen, in Denmark. Jewish community leaders at the time were upset that they were rebuffed in their request to place armed guards in front of synagogues and schools. And the government officials told them, they told me, we have a relaxed approach to security in Denmark. We're frankly concerned that our citizens would feel uncomfortable if they saw armed guards in front of buildings. And so they weren't, on principle, providing that kind of security. The reality in France and some other countries is many of the incidents of anti-Semitism, as they've been reported by Jews who've been targets, are coming from parts of the Arab and Muslim communities. Of course, we know that Arabs and Muslims in Europe are significant victims of prejudice and discrimination. But it has also meant at times it's uncomfortable for government leaders to kind of acknowledge this particular aspect of the problem of anti-Semitism or attacks on Jewish targets. So I had the experience in the Interior Ministry in Paris of being told, well, they can record incidents that come from right-wing populist groups. They can record incidents that come from left-wing anarchist groups. If people are saying these are incidents coming from what they perceive to be members of the Muslim community, they can't record that. French laïcité doesn't allow them to do that. So instead, they said to me, we have a term we're starting to use, intercommunal tension. Now it's a very, maybe it looks benign, but frankly, I think you can see the dilemma in this. There is a need for Muslim-Jewish dialogue. Obviously, there's a need for interreligious and interfaith understanding. But this is not somehow a problem made by and equal to two minorities outside of the society. But that term was already conveying that kind of message. So that simply added to the anxiety that Jews felt. If they feel the government can't even acknowledge the source of the problem, how confident can they be that a government is going to figure out the way to deal with the problem? So yes, we need to focus on the concerns of a Europe where prejudice is growing, where populist views are gaining currency, where attitudes toward minorities, whether they are Muslim or Jewish or Roma or LGBT or others, are certainly growing. But you really, I believe, cannot deal with an issue in a generic, let's promote tolerance and understanding, but rather you really need to target the sources of these problems to get governments to step up and to come forward. So thank you for this, and I hope I've kept to my time.
Perfect. You are great. On to you, Akila.
Thank you, Hannah. I'm very honoured to be here today and take part in this very important event. First of all, I want to say that any minority and any religious minority can experience discrimination and hostility. And in the same way, anybody can be the perpetrator of bigotry. I work with the Christian Muslim Forum, which is an interfaith organization which Rabbi Sachs mentioned earlier. And I just want to say that I was disappointed to learn that I didn't have the opportunity to be at that event with him and sit down and and share a meal with him, as it were, afterwards, and talk about some of these challenges. I also sit on the UK government's working group on anti-Muslim hatred. And over the next few minutes, I'm going to talk about some of the work that I've done with these two groups to tackle anti-Muslim hatred. And I'll also mention a little bit about how anti-Muslim hatred is playing out right now in the UK. Between 2014 and 2015, London saw an increase of near 48% of reported cases of anti-Muslim hate crime. This included violent attacks against individuals, and it also included attacks against Muslim buildings such as mosques. However, this 48% does not cover the huge amount of hate crime incidents against Muslims that remain unreported. At the beginning of this year, I personally suffered an incident of anti-Muslim hatred. I found the incident quite, well, it was very, very uncomfortable. It made me feel very anxious. And for the first time in my life, it made me think about whether or not I should continue to wear a headscarf. Because of the nature of the incident, I was with my young children. It was completely unprovoked. The only reason I could fathom for why this person targeted me was because I look and I dress like a Muslim. And unfortunately, incidents like the one I experienced are becoming the norm for many Muslims in the UK. And this has been corroborated by research at the University of Cambridge, which found that discrimination is a daily norm for many British Muslims. And this research also found that actually Muslim women are disproportionately affected by anti-Muslim hatred attacks. So you can see there is much work to be done to counter anti-Muslim prejudice in its broader sense, and also hate crimes directly. Through my work with the government, I and others recognize that government can play a key role in leading work to tackle anti-Muslim hatred, and especially around tackling hate crimes. The working group identified 3 key areas over the last year in which we felt that government could take this leading role. The first role was around monitoring hate crimes against Muslims and closing the gap between the number of reported hate crimes against Muslims and the huge gap of unreported hate crimes. Most Muslims do not report hate crimes. And so we recommended that the police authorities in the UK disaggregate the data on religiously motivated hate crime, and they specifically flag up anti-Muslim hatred crime as a separate category, as they do for anti-Semitism. This recommendation was taken up, and I'm pleased to say that it will be rolled out in the UK over the next year. But the work doesn't end there. Third-party organizations and third-party reporting organizations and civil society organizations that monitor hate crime are also very, very important in addressing this gap. And organizations like a group called Tell Mama in the UK do this very well, and they work closely with police to ensure that police have this data and that also victims are supported when they do report a hate crime. The other area that we've been particularly concerned about is the increasing number of attacks against Muslim women on British transport. These attacks have involved, in some cases, quite brutal violence. And again, it's mostly targeted at women who wear a headscarf or they cover their face. So colleagues and myself have worked closely with transport authorities and police authorities in the UK to make sure that they are aware of the type of incidents that are going on, but also to make sure that they are speaking to and working with community organizations, especially women's organizations, so that they can reassure these community members that women can travel safely. And if there are incidents that they experienced, then they know who to report it to and that they can be supported during that process. It's also very important for police to have a joined-up approach, taking into consideration the views of community members when they think about how they can tackle this particular problem of anti-Muslim attacks on British transport. The other area of concern that has been increasing is anti-Muslim prejudice and sentiments online, which are expressed through social media sites like Twitter and Facebook. My colleague Dr. Imran Awan has done extensive research on this, and he reports experiences of online anti-Muslim hostility lead to communities feeling a sense of fear, insecurity and vulnerability. And that when there is rhetoric online, this is also then mirrored with rhetoric and community tensions offline. Again, in the online sphere, we see a disproportionate number of women being targeted, and again, women who are visibly Muslim. So we have worked closely with companies like Twitter and Facebook to help them have a better understanding of the nature of anti-Muslim prejudice and bigotry, how it's expressed online, and also how they can improve their reporting mechanisms. A key recommendation that we've also taken to these companies is that they need to work with community organizations to promote positive messages about Muslims, and especially about Muslim women, that humanize them. Because all too often, Muslim women are viewed as either being oppressed or being potentially dangerous. And this binary view means that they are then dehumanized. And we know that when somebody is dehumanized, it's very easy to then cross that boundary and express hostility or worse towards them. In that regard, I set up an online platform called She Speaks, We Hear, and this brings together diverse women to share their everyday perspectives and experiences. But it also, through that platform, I also broadcast the positive contributions and achievements of Muslim women. I'm running out of time, and there was so much more that I wanted to speak about. I'll touch a little bit on the Christian Muslim, the work that I've done with the Christian Muslim Forum. So the Christian Muslim Forum works with primarily Christians and Muslims, but also other faith groups, to bring people together, to get to know one another, and to break down barriers so that communities can come together and stand united against hatred and extremism. And part of this work is having some very difficult conversations. One project I'd like to highlight, which I think is a really good example of best practice, is the Church Mosque Twinning Project, which we've recently launched. This project brings together a mosque and a church from communities which are in high levels of social deprivation and probably would not normally talk to each other. And what comes out of the twinning has been very, very powerful. So we have seen Christians and Muslims and other faith groups coming together to set up homework groups for their children, to address issues of employment for young people, and also to provide shelter and food for recently arrived refugees and asylum seekers. If I could just end very quickly with that, this type of work to prevent anti-Muslim prejudice, and indeed any type of prejudice, cannot happen overnight. It's long-term work, it's lifelong work, and it really means, investment by people of all different faiths and no faiths to come together. I'd like to leave you with a quote by a British Imam, Imam Qari Asim, who's a wonderful man. He says, "Peacemaking calls for courage, much more so than warfare. It calls for the courage to embrace dialogue and reject violence. Say yes to respect for agreements and no to acts of provocation. All of this takes courage, open-mindedness, and tenacity." Thank you, and I apologize for going over time.
No, that's good. That's good. Okay, Benjamin. I'll go like this if you're running a little over, okay?
I have my watch here, so I'm going to try to do my best. So thank you, first of all, also for inviting me and letting me speak, for letting, a young person speak here, letting speak the youth. That's
all of us here are young.
No, sorry. So involving the youth, or a youth organization, let's call it that way. So I would like, we discussed briefly, actually in detail, the views on what is going on in Europe today, and we heard a few opinions. I will try not to add too much to this, as I think we discussed it, as I said, in detail. However, I would also like to share a few perspectives from my side there, in order to then introduce you to the very organization that I'm representing here today, and then give you a few details, a few examples of how we work and what we try to accomplish with our work. I came here through Zaventem Airport, which is the airport of Brussels, where I live and work. And as the head of an umbrella organization that works in 35 countries, I tend to travel a lot. I use this airport on a frequent basis. But coming there now, a few weeks only after those attacks, have changed a lot of what I thought about what Europe is and what Europe should be. There were 15 security layers. My passport got controlled very often. And as it happens with racial profiling, lots of people do think that I'm Muslim. So I also got picked up, at least that was my perception, very often. I got questioned in detail. I was used to those questions from Israel, but still it felt very threatening. And I then wrote a newspaper article that got published recently in which I quoted that Brussels has changed everything but nothing. Everything because for the first time in Europe I have the feeling that everyone has understood that this is something we will have to deal with for a lot longer than only a few years. Other than after London and Madrid, people have gotten to understand that this is a movement that we will have to tackle. And to only share a small anecdote from a university in Hamburg, I studied at a university that was classically a very left-wing university, and I felt very comfortable there. But I remember this one day when, Daesh was already going on for more than a year. We had a discussion on whether this university body, the student body, should openly write a call against Daesh. And I sat in that room and I asked myself, how is it possible that A, this is a question, and B, that it took you a year to formulate that phrase? One of the reasons was because, to my mind, they were blind to discuss the chauvinism, the sexism that was not in the room of their university, which they discussed on a frequent basis, but which was happening in a country far away. But even those people, to my mind, have gotten to understand that there is something that we have to deal with for a lot longer. Now, why nothing? Why has Brussels changed everything and nothing? Nothing because our everyday life has not changed at all. Not in Brussels, because Brussels after Brussels is also Brussels after Paris. And in November, we already had the lockdown. But especially not for the Jewish community. Because in the Jewish communities, we were used to increased security measurements. We had paratroopers standing in front of our synagogues. Brussels after Brussels and Brussels after Paris also is Brussels after Toulouse, after Copenhagen, after the Jewish Museum in Brussels and Hypercacher. Now, for our everyday life, nothing has changed. And the generation that I speak on behalf of here today is the one generation that has never experienced a different reality than the one that I'm coming from, which includes security guards in front of our schools, in front of our kindergartens, which includes bulletproof glass in our classrooms, which includes security cameras. Another anecdote here, when I took a group of friends in Berlin to my school in order to show them the very school that I visited, a lot of them told me that they had mistaken the building for a prison because of the high fences. Now, why has nothing changed? Because our fences got built higher, and because for our community, long before that even, 1994, we speak about the bombing in Amia, for our community the security measurements have not really changed. However, Brussels emphasizes the role that the Jewish community can play within European society. And by that I mean that the lessons that we have learned from those incidents, those horrible incidents before, can and should be shared with society as a whole. And the one lesson that I want to coin here is that we have learned, we had to learn in so many painful ways, how to live without fear, how to not let fear be the determinant factor of our decision-taking process. And this is the last general thing that I will say in order to share my perspective with you. It was mentioned before. We speak about a European society that has gone through a financial crisis that was unprecedented in this century. We speak about a European society that is going through a refugee crisis these days that has polarized this society. And lastly, topics like Brexit concern people. So generally speaking, we speak about a society that is being led by fear, and we speak about a society in which political parties on the far right are making use of this fear. And the huge increase of online hate crime that has been shed light on in the past 5 to 10 years proves this ongoing process. Now, including conspiracy theories that haven't been mentioned so far, yeah, which are huge, especially in Europe. We speak about Germany, where an open, known conspiracy theory Facebook page has more than 2 million likes and is being quoted by politicians in public. Now, accordingly, our belief or our approach is binary. We want to work with society as a whole in order to serve society's needs, but also we work with a Jewish society. We care for their needs, but we care for society, for the needs that society as a whole has. We try to work within those fences and outside of those fences. So who are we? Shortly, a short explanation. We are the democratic representation of the 160,000 Jewish students in and around Europe in 35 countries. Students means students and young professionals, so everyone between 18 and 35. Jewish means everyone who defines themselves as Jews. And as such, we also represent those 160,000 people in front of political institutions, such as the OSCE, the UN, but mostly, obviously, the European institutions, the Parliament, the Commission, the Council of Europe. Now, one of the main approaches that we take, or one of the main credos of our work, is that A, we want to empower students to speak on their own behalf, because we think that one of the key factors in fighting any form of hate crime is to work with younger people and to also let them speak. And then secondly, we believe that Jewish rights are human rights. What does that mean? As much as we have to care for other people's human rights, we want others to also care for ours. It happens way too often that we sit on conferences discussing how to combat anti-Semitism, and we find ourselves surrounded by Jews. Jews speak to Jews on how to combat anti-Semitism. Now, this leads to nothing. We have to speak to the non-Jews. And as much as we do this, we also have to speak about what non-Jews are facing in their everyday life. So one of the concrete projects, one of the concrete steps that we took is that we built up a political coalition which we called a Europe of Diasporas. A Europe of Diasporas is a project that we did in alliance with the Roma and the Armenian community. The main goal of it was to build a political alliance. I mean, you know political alliances here in the US. There's a long tradition of alliance building in the US, which in Europe there is not. Not at all. The whole concept of political alliance building is still very new, it's very fresh. So along the way, we also had to learn a lot on how political alliances should work. But mostly we realized that the moment we amplify each other's voices, people listen. Also we surprised many people with the approach we took, because Roma, Jews, and Armenians speaking together, this is something new, this is something unprecedented. Now, we started this project 2 years ago. We were majorly successful. We will have a second term. We start a second round, so to say, later this year. But we now took the lessons that we learned from this project in order to start a new initiative, which we called Connecting Action. This is a joint program with the Muslim Jewish Conference, with Telmama, one of the organizations that you also saw in the movies, and 5 other interfaith initiatives that work on a European level that also are engaged with the OSCE. And together we now want to build a new network for interfaith initiatives. Why is that important? Because there are so many of these initiatives out there, but they do not communicate with each other. Some of them only work on a regional level. Most of them are grassroots. So also with regard to professional approaches, there's a lot to be done. We want to build this network in order to A, improve their work, but B, also amplify their voices. When there are crises that are emerging, we want them to be resilient, to be outspoken, to be heard. This is one of the main projects that we work on in the coming year. Obviously, again, interfaith dialogue being, as you said, nothing that works from one day to another. It takes time. And the most important, you shouldn't put pressure on it. Never expect a certain result, because you never know where the journey leads you. But also make sure that you don't stay superficial, that you actually touch the questions that are in the room. Now, lastly, aside from these projects, really 1 minute, we also are the political representation of those people. So we empower them to speak up in front of those institutions. We bring them to the UN, we bring students to the OSCE, we bring them to conferences like this and want them to speak. But also we take action. In order to show that we are part of the society, for example, when the refugee crisis became became, when people realized the whole scope of the refugee crisis, we started a European campaign where, to give you only one example, students from Switzerland started to collect clothing, food, rented a truck, and made a tour through the whole Balkans in order to show that we are also there, that we also want to give. And then lastly, as I said, if we want to combat anti-Semitism, we cannot only look at what is happening outside of our fences, we also have to look at what is happening in our fences. And there's a whole new topic that hasn't been addressed yet. Anti-Semitism, in the end, will win, in a sense, if it becomes, and this really reflects to what Rabbi Lord Sachs said before, if it becomes the determinant factor of how we define ourselves. If anti-Semitism is the foundation of Jewish identity, then indirectly it has destroyed Judaism. So what we try to do is to also provide a safe space for Jewish students in order to discuss topics they want to discuss amongst their peers. We try to balance their everyday life and their programming and also address topics of which we think are important for our community itself. Gender equality in Judaism, gender balance in Judaism, medical ethics, topics like this. Let me maybe conclude, and I really conclude now, by quoting the head rabbi of Brussels. The head rabbi of Brussels only a few weeks ago, I think less than 2 weeks ago, said that there's no future for Jews in Europe, and he's not the first to say so. Now, I can say that he's wrong, because he has every reason to believe so, and there are many others who say the exact same words. But I wouldn't sit here if I believed that he was right. Because I think that all of this will turn into a self-fulfilling prophecy if we give up now. And the one solution that I see really lies in grassroots activism here. There are so many good grassroots initiatives in Europe that do not get the support they should need. I need to come to the US in order to speak so much about my work, because in Europe, grassroots initiatives are not being heard to, are not being listened to. They do not get the support, they do not get the funding that they should receive, to my mind. So maybe let me conclude with a sentence that I really conclude. Whoever fears loses. Whoever tries does not fear. And if we want to combat the fear of European society as a whole, we also have to overcome the fear that is amongst us and between us. That would be it.
Thank you. Usama?
Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. With the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate. Thank you to Elizabeth and all the commissioners at the US Council. I'm also deeply honored to be here talking to you this afternoon. I work for the Quilliam Foundation, which is possibly the world's first counter-extremism think tank. We also place a lot of emphasis on human rights, because that's the positive side of the work. Counter-extremism is actually a rather negative agenda. But unfortunately, we were set up soon after the London, the 7/7 attacks in 2005, which was the UK's version of 9/11, sadly. And in fact, over the last 20 years, we have seen a steady rise in Islamophobia or anti-Muslim hatred in Britain. It used to be non-existent before, really. We mustn't ignore the fact that apart from far-right neo-Nazi racist groups, the actions of Islamist terrorists directly fuels anti-Muslim hatred and Islamophobia, and we see that in the spikes after major terrorist attacks. So it's after 9/11, the 7/7 bombings, the murder of drummer Rigby, and of course the atrocities committed by Daesh over the last 2 years that we've really seen this spiking. And hence our work on the theological and ideological aspects of countering Daesh's extreme ideology, which underpins their violence and gives it a sacred, holy justification, in fact, for every single thing that they do, including killing children, etc. Now, Muslim-Jewish relations, as an imam who's served as an imam in Britain for over 30 years, I began young, in case you're wondering. Muslim-Jewish relations have also increased, I'm very glad to report, and they're very important because we have seen a rise in Muslim anti-Semitism across Europe. Of course, in the old days it was Christian anti-Semitism or far-right anti-Semitism. Now there is this really worrying increase in Muslim anti-Semitism. On the other side, there is also a rise in Jewish Islamophobia. or anti-Muslim feeling. Many Jewish leaders have told me in Britain they are scared of Muslims, they're scared of Islam. And Jews don't have the numbers in Europe to be a threat to Muslims, actually. If you look at the numbers, for example, in Britain, the ratio of Muslims to Jews is roughly 10 to 1. In the world, it's 100 to 1. So there's no significant threat to Muslims, really, from that Jewish Islamophobia, except in Israel, of course. There have been a rise in attacks on mosques, for example. So we have a real worrying issue there. Now, for many years, Muslim-Jewish relations ignored the elephant in the room, which was precisely the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I'm pleased to say that that has been recognized, and people are beginning to address that as part of the resolution of these problems. But you have to do that very sensitively. And I found through my work was that before you address the Israeli-Palestinian or Israeli-Arab conflict, which is, of course, leads to all kinds of tensions, you have to build friendships first. If you have Muslims and Jews who are friends, and Christians and others, whoever cares, people who are actually close friends, then you can actually argue about Israel-Palestine like you argue about any other political issue. Kashmir or the US, or gun control, or, in Britain, left versus right, whatever it is, you can have a civilized discussion. And of course, that is the basis of a democracy. And I think it's very important to recognize that. And I think we've had increasing success in absorbing some of the Middle East conflicts over the last few years. As Lord Sachs said, we shouldn't be importing the conflicts from there, but exporting understanding from Europe to the Holy Land. People come from Israel and Palestine and they tell us, do not import our problems to your country. Don't become part of the problem. Become part of the solution. We had a Palestinian leader who came over, was asked about all this anti-Semitism in the name of Palestine, and he said, we're appalled. You are using our dire situation to justify discriminating against Jews in Europe, for example, or justifying joining Daesh. And they were absolutely appalled that the Palestinian situation is so often misused by not only Muslim extremists, but also the far left and the far right. But there is good news. I'm happy to report, as I said, a lot of work has been done. Some years ago, we launched the London Muslim Jewish Forum in City Hall, which is London's parliament, in the main chamber there. And that network of friendships, 30 Muslim and Jewish leaders came together to launch that. That network of friendships, as I said, helps absorb some of the conflicts and tensions. In Leicester, one of the large English towns, groups of Muslims defended the local synagogue. They actually held vigils, if you like, or patrolled the streets to defend the local synagogue. We have Muju, which is a Muslim-Jewish theatre company, which has been running for over a decade, very successful, brings together young Muslims and Jews who work on very exciting theatre projects. And of course, there are many other cultural projects like that in the arts and other places, and some of them come over from Israel and Palestine as well, of course. And I think it's very important that Muslims and Jews get involved in that middle position of supporting both the Israelis and the Palestinians. That's what we all want to see, is peace in the Middle East. We want to see a viable Jewish state and a viable Palestinian state as well. I mean, when you ask the people there in the area, in the Middle East, most of them also want the same thing. And it's unfortunately, people again misuse that problem to justify tensions in Europe. Now, the final part of our work, which I shall briefly talk about, my work specifically, is, as I said, dealing with the ideology and the theology which underpins and justifies discrimination, division, and even violence, as we saw in Europe. Ironically, for example, the appalling Paris attackers last year, the Kouachi brothers and Amedi Koulibaly and others, those French Muslim attackers were buried in Paris, in France. The Jewish victims were buried in Israel, right? And which just illustrates that we have to deal with issues to do with religion and state and citizenship. And where better to talk about this than in Washington, D.C. So, for example, the Marrakesh Declaration was mentioned, which was issued out of Morocco in January this year. And I was honored to be at that conference. It's a very important and historic declaration, the Marrakesh Declaration, drawing on aspects of the life of the Prophet Muhammad himself, peace be upon him, and his Medina Charter, possibly the first written constitution in history, in terms of extracting 13-odd universal principles from there to underpin the Marrakesh Declaration. I've brought along copies of my own essay on this subject. This is a 100-page essay, which is available for free on the Quilliam website, but it's called From Dhimmi to Democracy, Islamic Law, Non-Muslims and Equal Citizenship. And it tries to address some of these very basic issues, which I think are absolutely fundamental, because we will not, these problems will not go away until we have better understanding of how this works. So in a nutshell, what I'm saying is that the universal human rights discourse, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that has to be championed and owned by all the religions. My understanding is that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was written very carefully, precisely to get buy-in from all the major religions and cultures, and non-faith as well, people of humanist and secular traditions. And it's actually a very important document. In the US, I mean, this morning I went to the Capitol Hill in the Library of Congress. All the values that you see celebrated here, public welfare, the good of the people, equality, liberty, justice, fraternity, and of course, as we know, there's a lot of borrowing between France and America and their founding fathers. All those philosophies are absolutely essential for this work. And in fact, Islam has a centuries-old tradition, actually, in that kind of discourse, and I'll talk about some of it here. I also discuss some of the difficult aspects of Islamic history in that regard, including relations with Christians and Jews and Hindus and others. There were many positives, there were negatives as well. Muslims have to have an honest conversation around that. For example, I discuss ancient concepts like dhimma, religious tax, or jizya, religious protection in exchange for a particular tax, which ISIS or Daesh have brought back, for example, because they are literalist, fundamentalist heretics, whereas mainstream Muslim tradition and discourse recognizes that some of the rules of the Quran were for 7th century Arabia, were for their time, and were actually very progressive for their time, but they don't necessarily apply for all time. And in fact, verses pertaining to women and slavery and other matters also fit into that category. So it's very important to recognize the danger of literalism and fundamentalism, which really plagues the Muslim world at the moment, including Islam in Europe, and to move towards more inclusive matters. Now, we know Thomas Jefferson tried to do something like that with the Bible, for example, but I would end with actually, I hope again, an apt quote from President Obama, when he said a few years ago that he talked about inclusivist versus exclusivist interpretation of religion. And this is something I learned through my interfaith work with rabbis and priests and others, and also having been, when I was younger, I was a fundamentalist myself, as many people are. But all the major world religions and scriptures have exclusivist interpretations, where we are the only good guys and everybody else is going to hell, basically, and they're dehumanized, as Lord Sachs talked about. But all of the major world religions and scriptures also have an inclusivist interpretation, where we are all servants of God, creatures of God, children of God, whatever the term is, divine manifestations. And the only way forward, President Obama said recently that the only way forward really is for the inclusivist interpretations to dominate all of the major religions, because the alternative is division, is intolerance, is dehumanization, and the perpetuation of conflict. So that's how we work on the ideological and theological underpinnings, as well as the grassroots community and civil society work in terms of bringing people together and trying to solve some of these very serious problems, but with a clear vision forward. And if we have that vision of shared universal values, I personally can't see any other alternative to that, apart from the discourse of shared values, of universal values, universal human rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You know, what I fear listening to the challenges that you're experiencing on your continent, and I will say on our continent and others, is the fear that this might be the new normal. When we were in France, when we were in Paris after the Hippocacher attack, the students passed through the door at the school. Now, this is a country where there are not a lot of guns. And there were people standing with major guns. I don't even know what they're called, but they were major guns. And the students have gotten used to this. It's the new normal. And I worry that there will be complacency because of the new normal. My children, who are in their late 30s, tell me that a combination of social media and other factors means everybody's attention span is so much shorter now. We're on to the next thing. And as you pointed out, this takes a very sustained effort, and it will not be overnight, and that we have to keep trying. I will admit that there is an issue that I am hypersensitive to, because I'm the child of not only a Holocaust survivor, but the only survivor of his family. And so it was at my dinner table every night. And when I was traveling through Europe extensively, I was shocked at the degree to which Holocaust denial became part of, to some, a normal. Also, the old and not so old form of anti-Semitism, which is Jews trying to take over the world and these conspiracy theories. I remember a picture, was it Lithuania? Where it's a picture of Rabbi Baker being there visiting, and he's standing there, and they put in pictures of money surrounding him in the cartoon. You know, it's appalling that that's happening. But these are examples of old-fashioned anti-Semitism that preceded. I mean, a lot of it precedes the Israel-Palestine conflict. And I struggle when I hear of examples, whether it's anti-Semitism or anti-Muslim hatred, anti-Roma, and pick your poison, that how much of it is religious, how much of it is racial, and how much of it is political, and probably the answer is all of the above. But it is something I wrestle with, because if we can't define it, if we can't figure it out, I don't know how we effectively answer it. And I wanted to open up for discussion here how you see breaking, what are the biggest barriers that you experience in trying to implement your programs, your coalitions, your networks, in making a difference, in identifying solutions? What are the biggest barriers that you face, besides just fear? And fear is mammoth. Not everyone at once now.
Shall I go first very quickly? So naturally, because of my work around theology and interpretations, I think the Muslim world has a particular problem now of the loudest voices being dominated by fundamentalism and literalism, and an excessively politicized kind of hijacking of religion, if you like. Now, I'm very inspired by people like Lord Sachs, who said on British TV some years ago, he said, fundamentalism is a heresy. It's heretical in Judaism. Now, we have a serious problem in the world of Islam. I think most Muslims, of course, are like everybody else who want to get on with people, are very genuine and open to resolving conflicts. We have a problem with some religious authorities and political posturing in conflicts. For example, Saudi Arabia and Iran, for example, vying for leadership of the Muslim world, Sunni and Shia. And they've had a proxy war all around the world, actually, ever since 1979. That's a real problem. Other centers of authority, Al-Azhar in Egypt or other places, we have a lot of what you might call pre-modern interpretations, medieval interpretations of Islam, Islamic law still being taught. And those are used directly to justify violence, as you see with Daesh, or with the murder of the Ahmadi shopkeeper, the Ahmadi Muslim shopkeeper who Lord Sachs mentioned. This was a culmination of 30, 40 years of religious and political rhetoric coming out of Pakistan, and having a home in Britain, authorized by the Charity Commission. It's a registered charity, which is an anti-Ahmadi hate group, which was directly involved, actually, with the hate mongering, which led to a murder of a young man a couple of weeks ago. So hence, naturally, my approach is, or our approach, my theology team at Quilliam, is to look precisely at scripture interpretations and open up the interpretations to different possibilities, rather than giving to the extremist claims that there's only one interpretation of scripture or even of politics. So, the idea that all Muslims have to be anti-Israel. Well, I mean, that's just nonsense, right? This is a political problem, and Muslims can have a spectrum of views like anybody else can, or with the Palestinian problem or any other issue.
You know, one of the areas in general where we see a lot of the difficulties in sort of Western Europe are places where societies have become very secular. And so the challenge here really is, can there be a role for religion? The fact is that if you speak about efforts to ban ritual circumcision or ritual slaughter, we've seen that in Scandinavia, in the Netherlands. It's in many cases motivated by this sense that all religious groups really are somewhat dated. This is not what modern Europe should be about. In effect, it does bring Jews and Muslims together, but I can recall one Jewish leader in the Netherlands when they were confronting legislation to ban halal or shechita, saying, look, they were not making this argument publicly as an argument of religious freedom, because frankly, he said he thought more Dutch citizens believed in animal rights than in religious freedom. And I think it kind of reflected this. In France, it's a different situation, but it is a sort of enshrined tradition of laïcité or secularity, which frowns on any real open sense of communal identity, including and in particular religious identity. So ironically, at the very time that you'd like to find representatives of these religious communities, or communities that define to some extent themselves, if we say Jewish, it's not always or only a religious identity per se, but when you want to find spokespeople for these groups that can stand up, that can condemn anti-Muslim prejudice, that can condemn anti-Semitism, in a way they're lacking because the society itself has really looked askance at that. So I find myself meeting in Paris with representatives in the foreign ministry, and they speak about, we want to see imams in France in another decade really to be trained in France, to be able to inculcate French Republican values, which is a very sort of noble aspiration. But when you ask, how do you get there, you realize the dilemma, because under law in France, you can't use any government funds to train religious leaders. So instead, they are signing contracts effectively with foreign governments, with Turkey or Algeria or Morocco, to import their imams, to import religious leaders. Well, they're not necessarily going to come with that sense of Republican values, of appreciation for pluralism or diversity. So in many cases, the problem is now one where how can we return sort of religious identity in the positive way that people have been speaking about here to play a more significant role when it's most needed.
And bearing this in mind, I'd like to reflect upon another issue also that concerns in that case also Judaism, but also Islam. Because of this, people don't know, they know nothing about what is happening in those religions. I had a grassroots initiative in Hamburg in which I took people. In the beginning it was students, later it became teachers, and then it became like groups, school groups, to a synagogue in order to introduce them to Judaism. Now, why did I do that? Because most of the people never met a Jew before. They come there, they learned about Judaism in history classes when they spoke about the Holocaust. They then see the news and they hear about the conflict in the Middle East, but they never met a Jew. And the same, in many cases in Europe, also goes for Muslims. Let us speak about countries such as Slovakia, as Poland, where Islamophobic ressentiments are rocketing. But where's the Muslim population? Where's the concentration of Muslim population? Let us speak about the German countryside. So because of this tendency of secularism, that is more than secularism, by the way. It is laicism, actually, as you referred to. It is the idea is not to be atheist. The idea is to neglect everything that has to do with religion, and just act as if it wasn't there. When I go to the European institutions, I very often have the feeling that I'm being perceived as a religious cleric. I'm not being perceived as a political activist, which I am, as much as my peers on the Christian side of the table and on the Muslim side of the table. So this is definitely one issue, the way we are being perceived and the way people then also, I mean, this is the ground for stereotypes in Europe in general. Another point then is within the Jewish community, I very often have the feeling that A, there's not enough room for the young generation, as I said, and B, we very often, I said it before, speak to each other but not to others. I find myself very often in rooms where people speak about Muslims, they don't speak with Muslims. And this is something that has to change, and I think, again, this is something that my generation has to change. To give you one example, I went to a youth congress 4 weeks ago in Central Europe, and the whole congress was about Islamist terrorism. For 4 days, 500 people from 500 Jews met in order to discuss issues that would be of concern for them. Well, first of all, I was the only speaker under 40 by far. So I was the only young person on a panel on a youth congress, speaking on a youth congress. And then secondly, there was only one Muslim speaker on the last panel that we had. So what do we do there instead of, again, feeding fear and not trying to overcome prejudice? So being open in times of fear is very hard. And it's something that leads repeatedly to us being doubted also from our own community.
Good points.
I'd like to echo all the points that have been mentioned. And one of the challenges, I mean, there are many, and I think it's hard to identify the biggest one, but I think one of the challenges we face in the UK is the idea that the solution to violent extremism or extremism that comes from Daesh or extremism that comes from the far right in the form of anti-Muslim bigotry is that if Muslims become less Muslim, if they stop practicing their religion, if they stop wearing their headscarf, then all of those problems will go away. Right. When actually the reverse is true. If people had a greater understanding of their religion, then I think less likely they would be to commit acts of terror. And the flip side of that is that there's also a lot of scrutiny and pressure on Muslims in terms of whether or not they're integrated, how many friends they have who are not Muslim. But the reverse isn't true when looking at non-Muslim neighborhoods or communities and asking a non-Muslim person, you know, how many real friends do you have who are Muslim, for example? So I think that is a big challenge for me, that this idea that to sort of get rid of all of the sort of, you know, bigotry and the ills in the world, then we should all become the same and we shouldn't really embrace diversity. And the other big challenge is often interfaith is put down in the UK. It's seen as piecemeal work. It's just old people sitting around having conversations. But it's tremendously powerful. And I want to give one example. After the attacks in Paris, I and many of my colleagues, we felt so horrified by what had happened, and we couldn't believe what was happening. And we wanted to do something. We wanted to show our support for the people of Paris and solidarity. But we didn't know how to do that. So immediately after the Paris attacks, the next day, with the Christian Muslim Forum, I organized a vigil to be held in Trafalgar Square. And I was so amazed by the instantaneous support. We had over 200 people attend this vigil, people from different faiths, you know, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, non-faith, different minority groups. We had French people there. And we all took a few minutes to mourn the victims. And then we also spoke about how we would not allow violence to define us, and we wouldn't allow violence to win. That we could come together and defeat hatred and violence in all its forms. And the simple act of having a vigil was so powerful, and it demonstrated unity in a most simple way. And I think the other challenge is, how do we do those acts when there isn't a crisis that's happening? You know, how do we do that every day? And I think this is where interfaith comes in, but it's often just denigrated.
One of the observations I had, I continue to have, is we in the United States, we have a very short history compared to the histories of where you all come from. But there is a strategy that we have employed here in the United States that I think has been successful, less successful lately, and that is how to build meaningful coalitions around a specific issue and how do we move forward on it? And when I travel through Europe, I find that does not come naturally, and you mentioned that. So I find it heartening to hear how much coalition building is happening. I remember when the Animal Rights Party in the Netherlands, I think it was the only country that actually had an animal rights party, put forward the legislation to ban ritual slaughter. We heard from Muslims about how horrible that would be, and we heard from Jews about how horrible that would be, but they weren't working together. And when we brought them together, they had never been together before, and by the way, they were able at that point to kill the legislation. And in Sweden, when we had a mayor that was like fomenting anti-Semitism, and we went to speak out against it, we also brought together leaders of the Roma community, people from the Muslim leadership, and the Jewish leadership. They had never been in a room together. I'm so happy to hear some of those barriers are breaking, because I do think that's the way to do education. I think it's the way to do mutual respect and understanding. And the last thing I want to say before I thank you all for a thoughtful discussion is that one of the most powerful things I've learned is that if I, Hannah Rosenthal, speak out against anti-Semitism, it does not headlines make. But if a Muslim leader speaks out against anti-Semitism, or if I speak out against Muslim hatred, there's a different attention. So the message is important, but sometimes we have to seek messengers that can provide greater input. And you all are great messengers, and you're doing the kind of coalition work that is needed. And I thank you for what you're doing on the ground and for joining us today. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to now call Katrina Lantos-Sweat to come in and do some closing remarks, and then Jim Zogby.
Well, thank you. I also want to join Hannah in thanking this really very, very interesting and very enlightening panel. I'm going to keep my remarks quite personal in tone. It's been already a very substantive afternoon with a lot to think about, and so I'd like to kind of share some more personal reflections. One of my late father's favorite quotes was from Adlai Stevenson, who once said that solutions begin by telling the truth. And I think we've heard some very important truths here today, starting with Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks and his insights into the importance of asking not who did this to me, and transforming every situation of injustice, and there are plenty in the world, into one that gives rise, on the one hand, to a mindset of victimhood, and along with that mindset of victimhood, a desire to seek revenge against those who have done this to me. And I thought it was for me, it was a big insight. It was a reminder to me, both in little things in my personal life, but in the broader sweep of the issues we're contending with, to try to avoid that framing. Sometimes justice requires us to identify who has perpetrated a wrong, and none of us want to see the demands of justice unanswered. But it is not the right way for us to think about our lives and for us to imagine a way forward. I think we also heard some very important truths about the necessity of having honest conversations. And many people on this panel discussed that. Honest conversations, if I may say so, sometimes politically incorrect conversations within different communities and among different communities. If we cannot speak clearly, we cannot think clearly. And that does require us to be able to confront the realities as they are. And this will often be difficult. It will sometimes be very uncomfortable, but it is the only way forward. I loved what Hannah just said about the importance of building coalitions. I think that does grow out of a part of our American history and tradition of which I am certainly very proud. And that is this idea, which was unique and unprecedented at the time that it was embodied in our Bill of Rights, but really is of enormous value, has been to building our remarkably successful society, and I think has pertinence elsewhere in the world. And that is this idea, on the one hand, that government will not endorse an establishment of religion, will not inject itself, will not put a hand on the scale as it relates to matters of faith in the public square, but at the same time will in no way impinge upon the free exercise of religion. This sort of hit a sweet spot, and I think it forced us as a country throughout our history to deal with the discomfort, but the maturity involved in interacting in the public square with peoples whose views and beliefs about your most profound convictions are different from your own, but you are compelled to accept them as valid and worthy of respect in that public arena. And that does lead to that process of saying, yeah, we can work together because I respect you, because we are equal players in the civic square that we share. So a lot of just really valuable, practical insights for me and takeaways for which I am very grateful. I'd like to also say just a brief word about sort of some gifts I feel I received from my late father. As some of you know, he was the only survivor of the Holocaust ever elected to the United States Congress, became one of the Congress's leading voices on human rights and justice, and had a very universal vision of human rights and justice. And I often feel I got two very contradictory gifts from him. On the one hand, despite the fact that he had personally and his family had experienced and endured some of the very worst that humanity is capable of inflicting on their fellow human beings, he was a remarkably optimistic person. I loved that about him. And he was somebody whose optimism sort of informed the sense of perspective he brought to the immediate challenges of the day. Obviously, right now, we all see around us huge challenges posed by radical, violent extremism of different sorts, by clashes of communities and viewpoints in Europe, and as Hannah has said, here in our country. But one thing that my father would often say to me, and this is where this longer-term perspective came in when I felt overwhelmed by whatever the challenges were in my life. And he was Hungarian-born, so he had a very charming and warm Hungarian accent. And if I would say, you know, in effect, the world is coming to an end, this has happened, this has happened, this has happened, he'd say, darling, we are just bending a windy corner of history. And right around this corner are bright blue skies and wonderful opportunities. And I love that because when you are bending that windy corner of history, it is tempting to think it's never been this windy, the sky has never been this dark, the rain has never pelted this hard. Things are worse than they have ever been. But he had a perspective which was that most of the time, things aren't worse than they have ever been. And what we are going through now will not last forever. So that wonderful, optimistic sense of perspective was one of the gifts for which I was enormously grateful. But the other gift, which in a way stands a bit in contrast to it, but I think needs to go hand in hand with it, was the gift of the importance of vigilance. At the Lantos Foundation for Human Rights and Justice, which I had, we sort of use one famous quote from my father as our motto and sort of a guide to our task. And that is, he once said that the veneer of civilization is paper thin. We are its guardians and we can never rest. So this notion of never resting, it's a little different from never again because it is not an emphatic statement. It is rather a call to vigilance, a call to remain alert and aware. The Nobel laureate Elie Wiesel has said something similar when he accepted his Nobel Prize. One of his comments was that I represent those people who do not sleep well at night. And part of our mission is to make sure that others don't sleep well either. So this combination of optimism and perspective linked to vigilance is, I think, an important takeaway for all of us as we contemplate the challenges ahead. And the very last comment that I'd like to make, you know, I look around this room, I see familiar faces, I see some heroes of the fight for religious freedom, for human rights, for tolerance, for all those great things that we aspire to for the world which we inhabit. And we are all here very, very reasonable people. We approach things with reason, sort of in control. Our hearts are in it, and yet, you know, we tend to face these challenges through the filter of reasonableness. And that is a good thing, but our reasonableness must not handicap us in the struggle against those who approach these same issues from the diametrically opposite perspective that we are coming from, but with unmatched passion. You are probably familiar with the famous lines of the poem by Yeats, in which he writes that the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. My plea to those of us who care so passionately about this struggle, the struggle for the protection of the freedom of religion, conscience, and belief, the struggle against those forces that want to really destroy that which is best and most precious in our societies, is that we be determined to bring an equally passionate intensity to our advocacy for our common goals, our advocacy for our common humanity. Rabbi Sachs spoke about how we all are born with an innate moral sense, which I know animates everybody in this room. We must be the ones that have passion because, you know, Bill Clinton, a former president of ours, once said that, you know, it's an interesting thing, but in politics, in life, very often people are more likely to follow somebody who's strong and wrong than they are to follow somebody who may be right, but is so nuanced and so, I don't know, as Robert Frost, the poet from my home state of New Hampshire said, you know, he once said about liberals, they're people so broad-minded they won't take their own side in an argument. We have to take our own side in this argument. There is a big argument raging in each of our societies, and we have to have the passion to take our own side with eloquence, with vigor, with persuasion, so that people will be drawn to our message, not only with their heads, but also with their hearts. Thank you very much.
My colleague, Jim Zogby, who heads the Arab American Institute.
Thank you, Hannah. I want to thank the staff in particular for, Hannah and I had this idea a while back, and it always falls on staff to implement good ideas. I appreciate what you've done, and it has lived up to our best expectations, our hopes of what this would turn out to be. I want to thank my colleagues on the Commission for participating and also for their ideas that contributed to the sort of the shape of this discussion. I want to thank those of you who came and traveled long distances to be with us. I learned a great deal from this session, and I really appreciate hearing from all of you. I want to share just a few ideas. First is that it's a transatlantic perspective. I want to sort of look at mine and yours, our problem and yours. Islam and Judaism are viewed differently in the history of America and the history of Europe. Islam was at the gate. It was the threat from without. Judaism was the threat from within. In the origins and the rise of the nation states, it was the alien. So there was the alien within and the alien without, and roots are deep. The fear of the Jew and the fear of the Muslim are deep. They've taken new manifestations over the years, and now with the refugee crisis, yet another manifestation, with the terrorist issue, another manifestation. But they've been there for a millennia. In America, it was new. Our attitude toward Muslims and Jews in the beginning was quite different. Anti-Semitism, though, was part of the Christian tradition, and it was part of our history, who we were, but it still was different. It was different because of who we are as Americans. I want to get into that in a minute. There really was no attitude toward Islam in the beginning at all. We had a problem with Arabs and the Arab-Israeli conflict before we had a problem with Muslims. I mean, back in the last century, what we talked about was anti-Arab bigotry in cinema, et cetera, which didn't start until the '67 war, but then came on with a boom, and we grew up with that. The Arab is this, the Arab is that. It was 9/11 that changed and brought Islam and the fear of Islam to America. And with all of that, we have to acknowledge that we have a problem in America, a problem with anti-Semitism from the beginning, and a problem with anti-Muslim attitudes. FBI hate crime statistics demonstrate only 17 to 18% of overall hate crimes are religious-based, but of them, more than half are anti-Semitic, and only 17% are anti-Muslim. One of the reasons that only 17% are anti-Muslim goes to the point that you were making about the fact that our people don't report. They don't report in part because we have a problem. The people they have to report to are the FBI, and they're the people that they're afraid of. And so we've asked for a sort of a way of separating this out, and we haven't gotten it. But in any case, we have a problem with anti-Semitism. We have a problem with anti-Muslim attitudes. And they're real. The Southern Poverty Law Center tells us that there are 34 anti-Muslim organizations in America today. There are 10 Holocaust denial groups and 19 Christian identity, basically meaning anti-Semitic groups that are operating that pose a real threat to our civil society and to individuals in the society. And well, most of the anti-Semitic groups operate on the fringes of our country. It's not part of what could be considered politically correct or even acceptable discourse. You don't get a discussion of Jews owning Hollywood or owning the banks or whatever. That is not something that happens in polite discourse. That has not been the case for anti-Muslim behavior and attitudes. Mainstream politicians have literally used it publicly to advance their careers, and it's created a very negative political climate for American Muslims. In 2010, there actually was a campaign nationwide. It sprang up in 17 congressional districts against building a mosque in southern Manhattan. I mean, a coal mining district in West Virginia where there was no relation, there were no Muslims to speak of. The candidate who was running was opposed because he will support bringing a mosque to ground zero, was the argument. He had nothing to do with it at all, but it was a tool, it was a way to create fear and use the fear of Muslims. In 17 congressional districts, that happened in 2010. In 2012, 5 presidential candidates said that Muslims, if they were in their administration, would have to take a special loyalty oath before they could even be considered. And this year, we had presidential candidates again calling for a total ban on Muslim immigration to America. Since 2010, 36 state legislatures have either passed or are considering legislation designed to block the application of Sharia law in their states, which is kind of interesting because no one has proposed the application of Sharia law in their states. And so the legislatures are discussing it in an effort to create and to mobilize fear, to create more fear to mobilize, for no basis at all, other than the use of fear for a political tool. It's been disastrous in terms of our public opinion. In 2010, before this campaign got underway, public attitudes were not that good, but 48% of Americans had a favorable attitude toward American Muslims, not Muslims, period. 33% had an unfavorable. In 2015, 33% have a favorable attitude toward American Muslims, and 37% an unfavorable attitude, a tremendous shift in opinion. And before we go any further, I want to just share with you another, this is from some polling that we've done. I think, did you put the poll up? This is the top poll, is the extent of support for having a Muslim live in your community. And to show you that it's a shared problem. The first question we asked in a poll was, would you mind having immigrants from other European countries live in your community? That's in blue. And then we asked, would you mind having Muslims live in your community? The darker red is don't mind. The lighter red is mind with some reservations. The blue is, the red is about Muslims. The dark is mind completely. The lighter red is mind with reservations. The blue is regarding Europeans. As you can see, in every country, a significant majority would support Europeans living next door to them, but not Muslims. And the opposition, which is down below, you can see on Muslims is almost half and more than half in several countries. The other statistic is the second poll is the one that I was just speaking about, the favorable, unfavorable in 2010 and the shift between then and 2015. So the fact is that we have a problem, and it's a shared problem, and it's an issue that we have to deal with. But there's another area that I want to talk about, and that's the way the part of America that does it right, and that's the lesson I want to leave you with. That you mentioned organizing diasporas. We don't have diasporas in America. We have immigrants who become American. They feel that they're living in diaspora for a short period of time, but within a generation, they become as American as anybody else. And America changes as they become American. It's kind of like alchemy. It's a process by which literally the personality of the individual changes and the country changes too. There are bigots in America who say, no, we're a white Christian nation and these foreigners don't belong. But they do not define ultimately the culture of America. You cannot even begin to imagine America without its Irish or its Italian or its Polish or its Jews or its Arabs or its Muslims. The fact is that the impact of all of these on our culture has been so great that there's nothing called American that doesn't involve that. I remember a funny story when my wife was first married to me, and when my wife and I were first married, I got off a sick bed to come here, so I'm doing my darndest to make sense out of this. My wife called her mom one day to say, I had cousins coming over and she was making dinner, and she mentioned the 3 different or 4 Arabic foods that she was making, and her mother said, why don't you make American stuff like I taught you? And then she listed spaghetti and meatballs and went down the list. The fact is that you have to struggle to come up with what is American food, what is American dance, what is American music, what is American culture, period, if not the collection of all of this. And that sadly is not the case in Europe. There was an article in the New York Times that I saw this Sunday, I don't know if you saw it, called Oh, So Now I'm Bangladeshi. It was by an award-winning author in Britain, Zia Haider Rahman. He concludes it by saying he was angry because there was an article about him written calling him a Bangladeshi banker turned novelist. And he says, I'm not Bangladeshi. I'm a Brit. He said, it appears to be Britain's inherent cultural problem with otherness that makes it difficult for the native to call me British. Difficult even for those who one might naively hope should know better. If you're not going to call me British when I grew up in Britain, when I hold a British passport and don't hold a Bangladeshi one, when I don't even speak Bengali, when I was educated in Britain, worked in Britain, then you can be surprised if, doubting your good faith, I grab my bags and get the hell out of here. After all, how much more can I integrate? What more is it that you want from us? To be white? To be you? That's a problem. And it's a problem I know that's felt by many. 3 generations of being Pakistani in London and you're still Paki. 3 generations of being a Kurd in Germany and you're still a Turk. I was in London when they had an election a couple rounds ago. Headline in the Sunday Times was record number of immigrants elected, 23 to the parliament. I knew those guys. They were born in Britain, and yet they were still called immigrants. No one will call me an immigrant. My father was the immigrant. I'm a citizen. He was a citizen. I have on my wall, he came as an illegal. I have on my wall his naturalization paper. He came in 23. I'll tell you why he was illegal, because Senate passed a bill keeping Syrians out of America. They were called Syrian trash, was the term used by Senator David Reed from Pennsylvania. We don't need any more Syrian trash here, he said. And so the quotas were eliminated for people from, he was Lebanese, but it was called Syria back then. So I have my wall, his naturalization paper, and on top of it I have my appointment by the president, my parchment. To me, that's the American narrative. But it's not just that I get a passport. It's not just that I get a parchment. I get an identity, and America changes with me. Our concept of being American is more inclusive. And it's not just the Muslim, it's not just the Jew, but it's the, what do you do with the third generation of Polish plumber, the Polish plumber jokes in London? What do you do with the third generation of Pole grown up in London? Does he become British at some point? This issue of absorption, this issue of inclusion, this issue of the transformation of identity is something that I think that Europe, we can teach something. I think we have a lesson that we can provide. And so I want to acknowledge our problem. We have a problem in America. We can't duck it. We can't be to use the biblical, the folks who look at the splinter on our neighbor's eye and ignore the log in our own. We have a problem with anti-Muslim attitudes. We have a problem with anti-Semitism in America. But what we do right is we provide a light at the end of the tunnel for these groups. And we've been through this before. I mean, Jews were tormented in the 20s and 30s, as were Italians and Germans during World War II, not only the Japanese, but them too. And then in the 50s, again, there was a resurgence of anti-Semitism as Jews were viewed as communist, socialist, anarchist, whatever. And on and on and on in our history, with every group having to go through this bizarre, cruel, and inhumane almost entry test to get into the American idea, to become part of America. But it works. At the end of the day, it works. We have our down periods, but we have our periods of inclusion. And part of it is that we have a sense of wanting to do it right. When I was studying American history, I wasn't studying their history. I grew up in a home that spoke Arabic before English, but I grew up knowing I was American. I studied Lewis and Clark, and it was my story. I studied the Alamo, and I was there with Davy Crockett, and it was part of my personal narrative. And somehow that idea of the narrative of the country, including the others. So what you're doing with the Roma and the Armenians, so important to transform the European identity, to make it an inclusive identity and not this group or that ethnic group and not including others. And so I'm so glad we had the conversation, but it's only beginning, and it's one that we have to continue, as Katrina notes and as Hannah notes, and I appreciate the fact that you've come a long way, and I hope we can continue our discussion together. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. And so now we get to process it in our minds. I hate to bring people together without a call to action, and there have been several calls to action. But to refer back to what Lord Rabbi Sachs said, we have to advocate for the vulnerable, but we also have to conquer the lesser angels that we have. And when we fight the darkness in us, we are better at being advocates for fighting intolerance. And the last thing I would say is that I've read Lord Sachs's book, but whenever he talks about it, I seem to get something else out of it. I think the reciprocal altruism is the fundamental motivation behind coalition building. And so if we heed his call for that to be fundamentally how we view the world, we can get to the why can't we all get along. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Lord Sachs, and our commissioners for being here. Tom Rees, who is here, Jim Zogby, Katrina Sweat, and Robbie, who was here. Thank you for attending, and go get 'em.